Good morning. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Dr. Paulette Hazier. I'm the Chief of the Geography and Map Division at the library. It is my pleasure to have you join us both in person and online to the library for this 2023 Phillips Society Spring Presentation, A Globe on a New Plan, Peter Parley's Teaching of Geography to Children in the 19th Century America. The Geography and Map Division is one of the oldest special collections within the library, and it is the largest map library in the public world, and it encompasses more than 5 million cartographic examples, spanning from really almost the dawn of time to the present day. We do invite you to come back and visit with us either online or in person to see our collections more fully. I'd like to say a note of thanks to the Phillips Society. Over the years, the Phillips Society members have given maps not only from their collection, but have been very generous in their support, donating contributions totaling over $1.2 million over the years. Many of the members, including the members of Phillips, the Washington Map Society, and other regional map societies, are among our strongest supporters and for decades have participated in building the collections. These gifts help develop, enhance, promote the collections of Geography and Map Division to people everywhere. And this contribution also helps support events like this, and I thank you. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Stillo, curator of the Lessing J. Rosenwald Collection and Airmont Library in the Rare Books and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress, who will introduce our speakers for the program. Take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Paulette. So welcome everyone here. We are so delighted to have you at the library. As Paulette mentioned, my name is Stephanie Stillo. I am a curator in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. And it is my true pleasure to welcome you to this program and to introduce today's speakers. So there are certain divisions at the Library of Congress that seamlessly remind us that we are one library. The staff of the Geography and Maps Division and the Rare Book and Special Collections Division often can and do share enthusiasm for a range of topics, including medieval manuscripts and early print, atlases, and a deep and abiding affinity for visual communication. We love images, and it brings us together often. Today's talk by Jackie Colburn and Anthony Mullen is yet another reminder of the intellectual intersections of our two divisions, as well as the benefit and the joy that we receive by leaning on each other's expertise and engaging in our mutual love of collections. So it is my true pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jackie Colburn. She is a senior rare book cataloger here at the Library of Congress. I have had the great privilege of working with Jackie for about 6 years now and have witnessed her infectious enthusiasm for everything from contemporary artist books to children's literature. During her time at the library, Jackie has cataloged literally thousands of rare children's books and rare children's literature. During her time, she has also worked to garner greater interest in the Rare Book Division and inspire fascinating talks and blogs about our collections, and for that we are eternally grateful to her. However, I like to say that Jackie is in her most exceptional form when she's offering presentations to visiting educators and researchers, as well as the general public. She has a true enthusiasm and love of our collections, and we are so grateful for her for that. So it was Jackie's immersion in children's literature that led her to her interest in Peter Parley and 19th century American history and thought. So for today's presentation, Jackie is accompanied by Anthony Mullen, who hardly requires introduction. Tony is, of course, a retired cartographic specialist from the Geography and Maps Division and former librarian and fine arts specialist in the main reading room. Now, I have to admit that both before and after the pandemic, I saw Tony beginning to kind of researched more in the rare book division, and I couldn't have been more delighted to start my day with his kindness and expertise in our reading room. As many of you know, the library has greatly benefited from Tony's research into historical cartography of Latin America, the Caribbean, and the southern borderlands. Tony has also served as the associate editor of the cartographic historical journal Terra Incognita. In 2005, he was awarded a Kluge Staff Fellowship, during which time he used library collections to explore the topic of travel and exploration in Hispanic America from 1600 to 1900. For those of you that don't know, the Kluge Staff Fellowship serves to foster and showcase the library's homegrown intellectual talents, for which Tony was very appropriately recognized. So I couldn't be more excited to hear about the research that these two have been cooking up in the rare book division and G&M. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jackie and Tony to introduce us to A Globe on a New Plan, Peter Parley's Teaching of Geography to Children in 19th Century America.
Stephanie? You walked off with my notes. Yeah, our notes. That's right. Thank you, Stephanie. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Congress, and congratulations on finding LJ 119. We're grateful to many people for the opportunity and the wherewithal to speak to you today. But Tony and I wanted to make sure that we thank specifically Carissa Pastic and Amelia Raines of the Geography and Map Division for your advice and your assistance, and not to mention your patience. So Tony and I are excited to share with you some of our research on Samuel Goodrich. We'll be taking turns here at the podium as we talk to you about him and his books on geography for children in the 19th century. Goodrich used two pseudonyms, writing for children, Peter Parley and Robert Mary. He wrote and published on many subjects from the 1820s until his death in 1860. A search of his name in the ELSI database will bring up no fewer than 327 bibliographic records. And we soon realized in our research that almost half of his books are on history and geography. In fact, of the 95 books that we looked at in great detail, 45 have the words geography or map in the title. So our intention, when all of our work is done, is to compile an annotated bibliography of his work. Sometimes when you start a project, you wish, gee, I wish I had this, I wish I had a great bibliography on this. And then you think, oh, well, maybe I need to write it. So today we're going to show you examples of his instruction to children, American children, on geography, how he taught them how to read a map, and about the faraway places and peoples around the world. So his audience, it's good to remember, is, for the most part, his audience was white, middle-class children, and many of those children were not enrolled in a formal school. Many of them were learning at home. Just to let you know a little bit about Goodrich himself, he did not approve of his own education. His own formal education was very strict. He talked about the use of the birch and corporal punishment. And he also had no love for fairy tales or the stories about ogres and monsters that were supposed to entertain children of his time. He believed that childhood should be fun, that it should be a joyful time, and learning should be an enjoyable task. He believed that books on geography, history, biography, and the sciences could be and should be as interesting to children as fairy tales and other things he considered nonsense. So here we see Peter Parley. This is a frontispiece to one of his books on geography. Peter Parley going to tell about geography. He's a friendly, storytelling, gray-haired old man with a gouty foot. So he was the fictional narrator of many of Goodrich's books. And he does his best to turn geography lessons into story time. His image is found in the illustrations and the covers and the spines of many of his books. It's this casual air and sort of neighborly persona that helped sell millions and millions of copies of his Peter Parley books. And it's also a very early example of branding in children's literature. And you'll see, I think you can see it. You see, he's not really hitting the children with it. But they're coming in and he's welcoming them in. But behind him is a framed picture of Peter Parley. And that's exactly the image of the old man with the cane with the wide brim hat. That's often the image you would see on the spine of the book. And so he wanted the purchasers, which is usually the parents, to know that this was the Peter Parley book their children were asking for. Daniel Rosell, Goodrich's biographer, he says that, quote, Goodrich's Peter Parley series and his other school books were second only to McGuffey readers in their influence and their use. So these Peter Parley books were, you don't hear about it now, but they were everywhere. In 1856, by Goodrich's own count, 7 million copies of his books had been sold. By 1902, 42 years after his death, 28 Peter Parley books were still in print. So it's this popularity and the ubiquity of his books in the United States that make the content of his books and his method of instruction interesting to us and a worthwhile subject. We hope that you'll agree that they'll be interesting to you as well. So his approach to writing for children was innovative in two particular ways. His narrators, Peter Parley and Robert Mary, were his readers' companions more than their tutors. They were storytellers more than lecturers. And in his autobiography, he thought very well of himself. His autobiography was 2 volumes long. But he says of his teaching method, he says, I imagined myself on the floor with a group of boys and girls, and I wrote to them as I would have spoken to them. Thus, I sought to teach them history and biography and geography, and all in the way in which nature would teach them, that is, by a large use of the senses, and especially by the eye, the master organ of the body as well as the soul. So it's this, his friendly manner was innovative, and also his abundant use of illustration in his books sets him apart from the writers for geography that came before him. We should also note that his inclusion of so many illustrations and maps coincides with advances in printing at the time. It was the stereotyping and electrotyping that allowed for the mass production of textbooks at the time, and with relatively high quality illustrations. You'll see in today's slides as we move on that while his methods of teaching geography and history were innovative, the content of his teaching about the people and places around the world reinforced the racist stereotypes of his day. So we need to emphasize that he managed to see his readers in a new light, but not his subject matter. Let me give you just a little bit of background on him as a person before we talk more about his books. He was born in 1793 in Ridgefield, Connecticut. He was the son and brother of Congregationalist ministers. He was not an excellent student, and his parents did not encourage him to continue his education. So he had a discouraging and brief career as a store clerk, and then as still a young man, he joined a publishing firm in Connecticut. It was in the 1820s that he decided to write for children. And he realized, and rightly so, that most of the books for children at the time were printed in London. And he saw the opportunity to write books for American children, the American books for American children, written, illustrated, and printed in the US. He wrote on many subjects, with history being the most important to him. In his mind, history is based on geography, and it's all in the service of religion and morality and building good citizens. So while he lived and wrote in a time of great change and progress, I think it was 1793 to 1860, and while he welcomed the progress in the sciences, specifically, of his era, he continued to see the world through a very biblical and specifically Protestant lens. And now I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Jackie.
Oh, wait, we need to,
Oh, did we do
I
this?
forgot to flip it.
How kind of you.
There you go.
This slide features two finely executed engravings of a fanciful trip over Europe. On the left, we see Robert Mary, one of Goodrich's alter egos, shepherding a group of young boys and girls on an excursion, having just glided by Mount Vesuvius and Naples. Balloon flight seems to have been a source of fascination and wonderment for Goodrich. And actually, when you go into the book display next door, you will see 3 books in which balloons figure prominently. Goodrich was not alone, as inventors, writers, and statesmen of the late 18th and 19th centuries, including Benjamin Franklin, Jules Verne, and Thomas Jefferson, were among the many captivated by balloon flight. The text, and especially illustrations in this book, are meant to teach young people about the geography and history of Europe in a novel way, by traveling in a hot air balloon. This book is particularly successful in what English professor Alison Byerly calls its capacity to mobilize the imagination, a prerequisite for armchair travel. And of course, the children for whom this book was meant were essentially armchair travelers. By the 1850s, illustrations and accounts of balloon experience had been widely disseminated. Goodrich wrote in the preface to this book, "The purpose of this volume is to entertain and instruct the reader by carrying him, in imagination, with a party of adventurers in a balloon, over the most interesting portions of Europe. The design of the writer is to make every reader a party to the voyage. Balloon travel is an easy mode of traveling, and the opportunity it affords of rapidly passing from one country to another, looking down upon each and studying it like a map." The illustration on the right depicts the balloon as it glides effortlessly over the Giant's Causeway on the north coast of Northern Ireland. Goodrich noted that it was, quote, "a mass of rock reaching from the cliff down to the water, and even extending under it as far as we can see, consisting of upright pillars of stone, all formed into 5, 6, or 7 regular sides. In some instances, the pillars appear at a distance like pipes of an immense organ," end quote. The geologic structure in the background, dating to an earlier epoch and a lost world, contrasts with various modes of transportation in the foreground that represent modernity and the new, the sailboat, the steamship, and the balloon. Regarded by some as the 8th wonder of the world, the unusual geological formation was a source of much speculation in the 19th century. That is, what did the rock consist of? How old was this formation, and how did it really get there? In the text, Ellen, one of the children, speculates on the origin of the name of the Giant's Causeway. She asserts that, quote, "This was the fancy of the early and ignorant people of this region, but what was the real origin of this wonderful work? I suppose geologists could tell us." Mary, the companion and teacher, replies, "Yes, geology teaches us that it is the result of crystallization." Goodrich, speaking through Mary, is a proponent of the crystallization theory, which, according to Professor of English Alan Blackstock, held that basalt was precipitated from water and was deposited from biblical floodwaters, and thus due to God's continuing intervention. Jackie? Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Maybe we leave it up there.
Okay, good idea. This is one of my favorite illustrations of Goodrich's, and it's a very good example of the clever, child-centered, easy-to-understand ways that he explained large concepts. So here with rowboats and ships and lines of sight, he's teaching children that the earth is round and about the curvature of the earth. So it's a direct and simple illustration of a concept that would be difficult for children of any era to comprehend. If you've ever tried to explain the fact that the earth is round to children, they often want to know why people in South America don't fall off. right? So, but he doesn't get into gravity, but he does explain to children that wherever you are on the globe, when you look up, you see the heavens. And the phrase in the title of the book is the inductive plan of instruction, and that'll become more clear as we look at more illustrations and learn where he got his theories of teaching geography. But here in this illustration, and actually it's actually a tiny little book. That's the hard thing about putting books on screens or digitize them, is that the scale is difficult to communicate. But here, the illustrations are set in the press with the type, which is Goodrich's preferred way to illustrate his books. So there's no need for the reader to flip to another section of the book to see the engraved plates or to follow along in a separate atlas. This ease of reading was important to Goodrich, especially for his youngest readers. So none of this is to say that Goodrich was the only author illustrating books on geography for children. Emma Willard wrote and illustrated Geography for Beginners in 1826, and it's on the display table next door, which you'll be able to see in a little bit. But the reason we focused on Goodrich and his Peter Parley books is his over-the-top popularity inspired us to focus on his books. There we go.
From the early 1830s forward, Goodrich attributes his method of teaching geography to the Danish-French geographer Conrad Maspin. Goodrich terms this method the inductive method, whereby the student begins to learn about geography by observing what is closest to him, his house, the street on which he lives, the town in which he lives, and the county, and so forth. Goodrich's complaint about geography textbooks up until his time was that most of the geography textbooks began with the universe and then worked down to the world, the hemisphere, and so forth. This slide depicts a hypothetical John Smith's house with a barn, a mill, and a farm. The first thing to note is the clarity of the image. It is not cluttered. The image is reinforced by the questions and answers that accompany it below. Goodrich explains in the preface to this small textbook, quote, "The pupil is made to begin with the spot he lives. He is called upon to describe first the places and objects which have been familiar to him since infancy. He is then led to adjacent towns, and in the next place is made acquainted with his native state," end quote. In a National Geography for Schools of 1850, Goodrich enunciates his idea of what a map should contain and embody. He wrote, "Simplicity, perspicuity, and convenience. Lettering of maps should be peculiarly full and distinct. The whole of the country should be brought together," and by that he meant that the outline of the country should be very clear. "Distinct maps should be given, and care should be taken not to fill them with unimportant names which may bewilder the student and render all acquisitions obscure and imperfect." The map featured in this slide is from a small textbook, as you, well, I don't know if you're going to see it in the display or not, but anyway, it's from a small textbook, yet it well reflects Goodrich's concept of what a map should be. This is a map of a massive extent of the Earth's surface, namely the Western Hemisphere. Only essential information is presented, and outlines of the continents are strong. There are minimal place names, but the printing is clear. The map also highlights continents from surrounding bodies of water by shading. As a good Protestant and Congregationalist, Goodrich always reminded his reader that everything in the world was the creation of God's hand and served God's purpose. As many in the 19th century, he held that the earth was 4,004 years old. But by the late 1840s, he was willing to acknowledge that the earth might be 2,000 or 3,000 years older. Although he knew something of Darwin and his theories, he rejected them. And in the 1850s, he was influenced by Louis Agassiz, the Swiss-born biologist and geologist, who had emigrated to the United States in 1847 and who was shortly thereafter appointed a professor of zoology and botany at Harvard University. I should make note that that Agassiz really was considered a titan of science in the mid-19th century, and he was known for his theories of the Ice Age, and was considered to be a very careful scientist. But of course, as many here probably realize, he was also he did not subscribe to Darwin's theories, and he was also supported theories that supported racism. And today, unfortunately, his fame as a scientist, there's a shadow over it because of his racial theories. In any event, talking now about Agassiz, despite his opposition to Darwin's theory of evolution, Agassiz was methodical and careful in his research. And Goodrich dedicated his illustrated natural history of the animal kingdom to Agassiz, which was a book that was published shortly after Goodrich's death. But now to turn to this slide in front of us. Now I'm going to turn to this slide with engravings from Peter Parley's Geography of the Bible. In the preface for parents in this book, Goodrich tells us of a boy who knew the Bible and scriptures and who asked his father, "Was there really such a place as Jerusalem?" Goodrich's reply is that the question arose from a want of definite knowledge of the geography in which it was situated. In essence, Goodrich is stating that the way to make the Bible real, palpable, and believable is by starting with the geography of the Holy Land. He wrote, "If we carry the imagination of a child to Asia, if we show him that Jerusalem still exists, if we point out the Sea of Galilee, which is actually on the map here, if we make him understand the relative position of these objects, their distances from one another, if we show him hills, mountains, rivers, valleys where Christ and his disciples met, we take one of the surest means of establishing an early confidence in the truth of scriptures." This finely executed engraving depicts Mount Tabor as the sun rises to its left. Mount Tabor is located 11 miles to the southwest of the Sea of Galilee. It is a monadnock mountain, which means that it is an isolated mountain rising from a plain. Goodrich explains that Mount Tabor is a peak in the form of a sugar loaf, flattened on the top. The mountain is very interesting and beautiful. The view from the top is very extensive, and it is commonly supposed to be the place where the transfiguration of our Savior happened, as recorded in the 17th chapter of Matthew. The rising sun, with its piercing rays, may well refer to the transfiguration. This map has no title, but it is a map that shows 5 climate zones of the Earth. When Jackie and I looked at this map, and we looked at it obviously more than one time, Jackie said, "You know what? This really is about latitude is destiny." So that's the name of the map, according to us. And it really is about latitude is destiny. The map is intended to illustrate 5 climate zones across the Western Hemisphere. As historian of science Sebastian Grevesmühl notes, theories concerning climate and climate zones date back at least as far as Macrobius and to late antiquity, circa 400 AD. He held that the Earth had 5 bands of climate zones made up of 2 frigid zones, a torrid zone, and 2 temperate zones, and that only the temperate zones were habitable. This was the basis of climate theory until about 1750. By the early 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt and others were looking at climate and representing climate in a slightly different way. Humboldt's temperature measurements led to a theory of climate based on temperature and not based solely on rigid latitudes. This is particularly interesting in the case of Goodrich, for one of the principal geographical writers who had influenced him was William Woodbridge, who had already adopted Humboldt's perspective on climate and the need to visualize mean temperatures on a global scale. And you will see in the adjacent book display, you will actually see the isothermal climate chart that Woodbridge developed in the 1830s. According to Goodrich, the climate zones of the Earth were fixed categories between certain degrees of latitude. So there's the Arctic, the North Temperate, the Torrid, the South Temperate, and the Antarctic. These zones between definite latitudes influence flora, fauna, natural productions, humans, society, and civilization. Based on this, he claimed that peoples and races who lived in the two temperate zones were the most creative, industrious, and intelligent, because the temperate zones allowed for more productivity and industry. Goodrich considered the torrid and Arctic zones to be respectively too hot and too cold. The Arctic zone literally stunted man's growth, and the torrid zone made people too idle and lazy. On page 8 of this textbook, Goodrich asks his reader, why is climate very important? He answers, because it determines the character of the vegetation, of the animals, and of the people of countries to a great degree. If one only knows the climate of a country, he can judge what trees, what animals, and what kinds of people there are.
This is the frontispiece from the Universal History on the Basis of Geography. It was a very, very popular book. It was first published in 1837, and it eventually sold more than 1 million copies. This frontispiece and its attendant title page were on display in the library's Books That Shaped America exhibition in 2012. And yeah, it just says, it tells us so much about what the accepted norms were of the time. And in that regard, we need to understand that books written for children, we didn't break ground in children's books. If something was in a book for children, it was already an accepted idea. And for that reason, it's a very interesting way to see what was normal at the time. And textbooks can be particularly interesting in this regard. Ruth Miller Elson wrote a book called Guardians of Tradition, and it's about textbooks in the 19th century. And she says that they offer us the common denominator of American intellectual history. She also suggests in that book that the images presented in 19th century books on geography may have been the longest lived in readers' minds and the hardest to overcome as that student grows into adulthood. And this, she says, is because most people at the time didn't get out much. They stayed home, they didn't travel, and so they had no experiential knowledge of faraway lands and the people there to contradict what was presented on those pages. So with this in mind, we can take a closer look. I hope you can see it on the slide, but the top illustration is the savage state, and then the barbarous state, the civilized state, and finally, at the bottom, the highest state of civilization. And I think this is just such a good example of the perception of the world in the 1830s and 40s in the United States. So the savage state, there at the top, appears to be an illustration of Native Americans, 3 of whom are standing in front of a tent, and others in the background are fishing and hunting. And the illustration of the barbarous state has a similar layout, with a hut on the right and what may be a family group standing in front of it. On the left is what I think is an idol. It's an idol of some kind with 2 men bowing before it. And the trees tell us that this is what Goodrich would have considered the torrid zone. The civilized state appears to be in an Asian country. It's an urban setting with large, substantial buildings. The people the only people in that image are riding elephants, which means so that these people, they're very much in control of nature, that they are in charge of nature there. And then the final illustration, the highest state of civilization, which we have magnified on the slide, is a New England town with a church, a school, a factory, a steamboat, and in the center of it all, a locomotive. So while these categories of people and cultures were disseminated and popularized by Goodrich, they were not developed by him. The concept was established in writing for adults at the time, including Conrad Maltz Brune. It's just so interesting to us that these images were presented to children at the time, and we can imagine that that followed with them into adult life. These images are from a book on natural history, and we see the same white supremacist views of his day expressed in even more stark terms. Goodrich will write about the human family and God's love for all people, and then he goes on to write about a hierarchy of the races that are not unlike those panels we saw of the states of civilization. And he writes, quote, "Man is not, however, in every country the same creature. The western part of Asia, the north of Africa have been possessed since the dawn of authentic history by a white-skinned race, the highest in intelligence and the most elegant in form, named the Caucasian variety." So in these two illustrations of mothers and their children, we see an extreme example of Goodrich's use of popular stereotypes of his day to describe people of the world, noted in places he's never been and people he's never met. But note that the Caucasian mother is portrayed as caring and careful. The child is in a protective embrace. At the African mother's, children are roaming around at her feet, playing with dangerous-looking reptiles. She's smoking, which, if not considered dangerous at the time, was certainly not appropriate behavior for a good mother. So seeing his examples, he's been promoting this states of civilization idea and then this hierarchy of the races. We were interested to see, well, what does he say about slavery in the American South? And here's an image from a system of school geography, which was published in 1830. And here he describes a southern state, a slaveholding state in the U.S. The enslaved people are tilling the soil, and the idle planter is nearby on horseback. Goodrich is often described as a moderate abolitionist. There's a very dramatic example of his anti-slavery writing in a book about the sea published earlier in his career. In Peter Parley's Tales of the Sea, 1833, he describes in really heart-wrenching and graphic terms a slave ship from which only 30 of the original 150 captives survived. Then he goes on to describe an auction of enslaved people in a southern state where they were treated inhumanely and family relationships were destroyed. And he tells his young reader, I'm going to quote this, he says, "Now all of this is very shocking, and in a land like ours, where we boast that freedom is the right of every man, it is painful to think that such things exist, yet they do exist. And every good man is bound to exert himself ardently to relieve the country from the crime of holding thousands and thousands of our fellow beings in slavery. Let us not be unjust to the people of the southern states. Many of them are good people and anxiously wish that somehow or other the slaves may be set free. There are others, I'm sorry to say, who insist upon it, that slavery is right and necessary. These certainly are bad men and deserve rebuke." We found it interesting that this description of slavery didn't appear in one of his books on American history. It's a book about the sea, where the rest of the book is about whaling. There's things that happen on the Atlantic. And a book about American history would have had a much wider audience. So one of the things that Tony and I are doing in our work on this author is we're trying to look at contemporary reviews of the work and also advertisements for it at the time. So this book, Tales of the Sea, with this chapter on the slave trade, was reviewed in the Charleston Courier, Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm going to quote it for you. He says, "A little volume bearing this title has been shown us containing matter of most incendiary character, and we warn booksellers and others against vending them in this community. A reference to one of the chapters will at once satisfy anyone of its mischievous tendency and induce those who have them on hand either send them back to the place from whence they were received or consign them to the flames." So some Southerners were encouraging the burning of his books. and others were much more accepting. Goodrich he attempted to play the middle of the road on possibly the most volatile topic of his time, and try to maintain his popularity in both the North and the South. So how can he, on the one hand, declare the evils of slavery and offend some but not all of the book-buying public? I think part of the reason we need to do a little bit more reading on this, but for one, he seemed to condemn slavery but not the slave owners. Goodrich's cautious approach to American slavery is in contrast to the work of Lydia Maria Child. She also began writing for children in the 1820s. She was the founder and the editor of the Juvenile Miscellany, which is a very popular magazine for children. And she grew to be a Garrisonian abolitionist. Probably her most famous work was an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. And she argued, among other egalitarian ideas, that Africans were the intellectual equals of Europeans. Her abolitionist writings severely damaged her career of writing for children. She became this leading abolitionist and a real hero for the cause. But in 1834, after this appeal came out, the Juvenile Miscellany folded because so many families discontinued their subscriptions in the South and the North. So Goodrich wrote for children about the evils of slavery. He looked toward a brighter day when slavery no longer existed. And while he was an abolitionist, he avoided direct association with the movement. His desire for national appeal for his writings seems to have encouraged him to avoid offending either the North or the South. There we go.
In Tales of Peter Parley About America, Goodrich asks his young white audience, "Did you ever see an Indian?" This was a loaded question. By the 1820s, most white people, especially in the North and East, had not seen an Indian, but virtually everyone had heard stories and had read accounts that occasionally portrayed Indian bravery, strength, and stoicism, but more often than not emphasized Indian treachery, bravery, and barbary over a period of 2 centuries of Indian and white conflict. Indeed, in 1826, the year before Goodrich's first book, James Fenimore Cooper published The Last of the Mohicans. Goodrich's writing suggests that he was deeply ambivalent. On the one hand, Goodrich acknowledged that the Indians' quote, ability to think, reason, suffer, and feel compassion, but was lacking in religion and moral beliefs. Consistent with his idea of civilization, which Jackie has just discussed, and which was an idea held by many educated white Americans of the antebellum period, the human species was divided into either 4 or 5 races. However, these races were not deemed equal, especially in terms of intelligence or industry. In his 1842 book on natural history, Goodrich wrote that, quote, "In America, when it was discovered 350 years ago, a 5th race of a copper color and no superior intelligence was found in a generally barbarous condition. This is called the American race." In this slide, Goodrich presents us with 2 views of groups of Indians. The first on the left dates to 1827, while the one on the right to 1839. As you will see in the book display, several of Goodrich's textbooks include somewhat fanciful images of typical people posing or gesturing and wearing typical costumes of their countries or regions. This is what is meant by the term costume geography. Similarly, Goodrich uses these images to show how different Indians are from whites in terms of dress and accessories. The 2 engravings are from an earlier and later edition of the same book, and they're actually found in the same place in each book. The first engraving, the one on the left, depicts a warrior with quiver and arrows. In one hand, he holds perhaps a weapon, while in the other, he holds a calumet or ornate peace pipe. To his right stands a woman holding a child by the hand, and further right is perhaps a family group consisting of a man with a rifle who stands slightly behind a woman holding an infant. White children and parents would instantly perceive a family group similar to their own. Little in this rendering suggests menace or hostility, but in the second engraving to the right, the tone conveyed is quite different. While it is true that the Indian on the left smokes a peace pipe, the lines in and folds of his clothing are similar to all the tattoos and swirls that adorn the warlike Indian to his right. And the warrior holds a tomahawk in one hand and a scalp in the other. His adornment and ornamentation camouflage him and make his body almost unrecognizable. Both representations can be read as stage representation, which, as historian Philip Deloria, who happens himself to be a member of the Dakota Nation, has described as, and this is really an important concept, representation and imagery of Indian bodies and cultural acts detached from lived realities, divorced from lived realities of indigenous peoples. The idea that we're seeing a group of people represented in terms of what they wear, but divorced from a reality of interaction. Could the difference in representation between the 1827 and 1839 books be linked to changes in white-Indian relations over that period? Through the 1820s, the white population of the United States increased significantly, and white settlers constantly sought out land in newly created states. This was a continuing source of conflict between whites and Native Americans. In 1830, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi River in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. And during the fall and winter of 1838 and 39, and I want you to remember the date, 1838 and 39, the Cherokee Nation, who had resisted thus far, was forced to migrate west of the Mississippi River. Although Goodrich did not address the subject of Indian removal in his textbooks and other histories, his atlases nevertheless reflect this development. On the left, we see Georgia from an 1836 atlas, and on the right, we see the same state from an 1839 atlas. The 1836 atlas clearly shows the Cherokee Nation and, in the northwest portion of the state, while in the 1839 atlas, the Cherokee Nation has literally disappeared from the map, replaced by a set of counties and county seats. When you see these maps in the book display, you will notice that the names of other tribal nations have also been erased. In this way, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations have disappeared from the map, and their former lands have been legitimized as additional counties in the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. In 1844, Goodrich explained to a general but more adult audience what had happened to American Indians. And this is an important summation. At the time of the Jamestown settlement, the number of Americans was estimated to be between 500,000 and 4 million people. In the space of a little more than 2 centuries, they have been swept away, with the exception of a few significant remnants. Most of the tribes are extinct and are without a name except in the pages of the historian. A few have receded before the tide of civilization, and their descendants are found scattered throughout the Great Valley of the West, end quote. This passage attributes no agency for this activity other than the curiously neutral sound of tide of history, and we thank you. Thank you.
Is this on?
Are these presents?
We had one question online. Do we know who did the illustrations for these books?
Who did the illustrations? I think Goodrich may have designed many of them, but he didn't actually, he didn't create them, but I think in many cases he directed them. Yeah, that we definitely want to investigate, because illustration was such a big part of his work for children, and we're going to be investigating that. further.
My question's along a similar line. I think you said that he did not travel very much. So where did he get the information for the maps? But the other question related to that is, what is the printing technique for these illustrations since they were incorporated into the body of the text?
It would have been, like the one with the curvature of the earth is a woodcut. And it's in the, it's in the press with the type. But often at that time, stereotyping was being developed. And so they would use that method to copy it and then be able to reproduce it over and over and over again. Without the stereotyping, if you wanted to produce another edition or more copies of it, you'd have to reset the type, find the illustration, and put it in. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot that there was a first part to your question.
Did you say he traveled very much?
He traveled. He lived in Paris.
He was consul in Paris between. He was consul in Paris between 1851 and 53, and then continued to live there to 1855. I think that's the most important trip that he took. I mean, he was known to have visited England in the 1830s, or is that right? So.
Yeah, he took a very important trip early in his career. He went to visit Hannah More, who wrote for children in England. And he considered Hannah More's writing to be just one step below scripture. Her works for children were going to save the world. And she may be the source of the term Holy Hannah. As of Holy Hannah, what might have come from Hannah More. But one of the criticisms of, say we want to spend more time with the reviews of his, contemporary reviews of his work to see what other people thought of them. And many of the British audience, the British critics did not think much of his work. They thought it was too much of a gloss over, there wasn't enough detail, there wasn't enough, there's one book, he's describing a part of London and he gets it wrong, and this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But it's interesting too that while the critics were saying that, your books are not good enough for our children, British publishers were pirating his work, or not pirating his work, but also they knew that the name Peter Parley would sell books. So they even had one of his, they had Peter Parley attending a coronation, and which he would not have done. The man was an American. And, but so there's an interesting contradiction there, that they knew this would sell books, but it's those Americans, yeah.
I can bellow it, and then you can repeat the question. You talked about his popularity. Who was the second runner-up? Who was the second runner-up in popularity in writing this kind of pedagogical material? And was there a regional difference? For instance, I don't know, say that there was a second runner-up who was more appealing to homes in the Catholic tradition. Is there any kind of regional adoption pattern that you've detected in the way Parley's work was adopted versus whoever the second runner-up in writing such material was?
This is a good question. I don't think we've really explored that at this point, to this point, which is not to say it isn't totally legitimate, because there certainly are sectional preferences in his book. I mean, he's from New England, and he identifies with New England, and as you can see from some of the images that we showed you, New England represented to him what America should be. I mean, it comes down to that, but I'm not sure I answered your question. But.
I was interested to see that, yes, yeah, New England does things the right way, and in Goodrich's mind. And it's interesting, part of his issue with the South wasn't just slavery, but he thought the slave owners, that Southerners were lazy. That in the North, we do our own labor. In the South, we don't. And he would write about the negative effects of slaveholding on white people, which I found interesting. In terms of who was the runner-up, Woodbridge was popular, and Emma Willard. And you'll see, we have examples of both Woodbridge and Emma Willard, who is probably more famous for her education of women. She had the Troy Seminary for Girls?
Right.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But these three authors come from really New England, so that's.
Yeah, that's still the focus.
Missed it. Did he himself have children, or was he ever married?
He had 6 children. He moved from Connecticut to Boston. It's interesting in his autobiography, which I read, his first wife, he mentions getting married, but only says her father's name, that she married the daughter of this important person. And that's the last we hear of her. And then he married later and had the children and lived in the Boston area.
Well, Jamaica Plain, right?
Yeah.
Right, in Jamaica Plain, for those of you who know Boston. So,
Online about whether there's data on how many books were published.
Let's see, 12 million copies. In terms of how many titles is something to figure out, because he would repeat them with different titles. So again, Peter Parley, the name sold books. And so he even tried, in fact, that this farewell, Peter Parley's farewell was the name of the book. And he was saying goodbye. And then Robert Mary, that pseudonym, came into more use.
I just want to say, I hope it came across in how we presented this, but I'm not sure. He was a tireless self-promoter. I mean, he was tireless. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with ambition, but he was not always careful. And there were critics who said he got his facts wrong sometimes, and the prefaces in his books there's a preface to the instructors, preface to the parents. There's sometimes he uses a publisher's note to talk about himself, So he's out there, right?
So we need to sort out how many actual works there are, and then when he moved on to Robert Mary, it would be Robert Mary's blah blah blah, edited by Peter Parley, because that name was going to fly off the shelves.
Thanks very much. He has and uses detailed geographic information. Do we know anything about where he obtained that? What were the origins of the geographic information that he's portraying in maps?
Well, if you mean, he does at times acknowledge people that he's used, specifically William Woodbridge, who was his contemporary, and Emma Willard. And then, of course, he acknowledges earlier geographers, specifically Samuel Morse. And I mean, he talks about it in American geography, or geography for American students, but the reality is that oftentimes he's using still British sources. I mean, one way to pitch yourself and to pitch yourself as different is to say, we need an American textbook for American students. We don't need a British, we've already had too much of that. That's true in a certain way, but what's out there, what is already prepared, and many times he's using information from those other sources.
Was he ever hauled into court for some of the shady dealings that I hear here? And the last question is, how did he come to, how did he die? Did he naturally? Or?
I don't know. We don't know how he died.
I don't think he was hauled into court, but he hauled others into court. When, let's see, William Tegg, T-E-G-G, William Tegg was a British publisher who would at least not, he was using the name Peter Parley to sell books in England. And there was no international copyright at the time, and Goodrich was livid. And not only because he was making money off of his reputation, but also he was selling books that Goodrich considered substandard.
Yeah, I was curious, you mentioned that he said when anywhere on the planet you can see the same skies, and I was curious if he did any sort of astronomical teachings or looking at the moon or the sun, or if he was really focused on Earth.
Actually, his science books are some of my favorites. That's how yeah. Peter Parley's Tales of the Sun, Moon, and Stars, and it's on display. And I was so interested to see, well, what planets did they know about? He has these fabulous illustrations of how to understand orbit. And there's this, there's a boy, swinging this thing over his head, and how that describes an eclipse, and there's a he tells children how to set this up with a candle, and his science books are fabulous.
Also, how he explains how far it is from the moon to from the Earth to the moon. Do you remember?
That's right. That's on display. He describes that the moon looks like this small disk in the sky, but actually it's very large. And he uses a hot air balloon as an example. Here on the ground, it's gigantic. It's as big as a house. But look, as it drifts away, it gets smaller, and it looks like it's smaller and smaller. And the bird, right? A swift bird. It would take a swift bird 80 days and nights to fly from the Earth to the moon. But a child could think about that. That's something that he could hold on to.
It goes with the inductive method, the idea of, understanding something as a child could understand, which, I don't know, 237,000 miles or something like that. So that's an abstract concept, whereas the idea of the bird, at least you know what a bird is and how it flies.
He describing the planets. He says that the Earth is like a pumpkin in the sky. And the ants on the pumpkin, those are the people and the ships going around the Earth. And all these children had seen a pumpkin. So he tried he would relate these concepts to things that the children knew.
Well, I want to thank you, Jackie and Tony, for this great presentation. Thanks everyone who's online with us today and everyone here in the room. For the folks online, we will have some video for you to see the materials that will be on display For our audience here in person, I welcome you to join our colleagues in the next room to see the book display. Thanks so much.